Laura's family here and our family here, and thank you all for being here with us. Laura and Nathan, this first question is for both of you. You both, as reporters, have met Yitzhak Rabin behind the scenes. What was he like in real life? Laura, will you start, please?
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. I'll just belt it out. Thank you. And thank you for that incredibly moving show. I have like tear streaks down my cheeks. It was just remarkable, so thank you. And I'm glad that we could all share this together. The last time I saw Rabin was a beautiful, happy night. It was at the White House. It was July of 1995, just 4 months before he was assassinated. I was a party reporter for the Washington Post for that night, and I was assigned to cover the celebration of peace between King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton was there as the sort of master of ceremonies. It was incredible because, you know, you would think that these were new allies, but they really, Rabin and King Hussein connected like old friends. They were clasping hands and whispering. You were there too?
No, but I remember the famous cigarette that they shared at the White House. Yeah.
Right, lighting each other's cigarettes and whispering jokes. You know, neither of them really liked the fuss in the ceremony. They had been meeting for years in secret. And it was a beautiful night when the night was over, King Hussein looked to the President Clinton. He said, "I'll show myself out. I know the way." You know, that everybody was kind of old friends. There was a circle of trust. I remember the toasts. So you had King Hussein, because he didn't drink alcohol, as a Muslim, he was toasting on sparkling water, and Yitzhak Rabin toasting on kosher wine, and Al Gore, the vice president, was trying to say l'chaim with his southern accent. It was marvelous. And on the way out, Bill Clinton knew me because I covered the region, and he looked at me and he said, "Laura, fingers crossed." And you know, about 7 years later, when I saw him, I'd written a book about revenge in the Middle East, and he remembered, of course, how much I was invested as he was in that whole peace process. He said, "You know, I never loved a man as much as I loved Yitzhak Rabin." And he said that if we had gone on that path, if Yitzhak Rabin hadn't been assassinated, within 2 to 3 years we would have had comprehensive peace across the region. And the last point I just want to say is that, you know, Rabin, the character in this play that we all just watched, said that Arafat is my enemy. And in fact, you know, he didn't really want to shake hands with Arafat. He agreed to in the end, and he said, "Okay, but no kissing." This is something that he worked on with Bill Clinton behind the scenes. Remember, before they went on the they practiced like hand locks, right? If Arafat tried to kiss Rabin or Clinton, they were going to stop him. But the remarkable thing is, 2 weeks after Rabin was assassinated, I was in his home. It was Shabbat morning. They were getting ready to have Shabbat lunch. Leah Rabin, the widow, and her children and grandchildren. And they were talking about during the Shiva that Yasser Arafat had come to their home on the 3rd day after the funeral. It was the first time that the Palestinian leader visited the state of Israel. And he came into their home humbly. He took off his keffiyeh. Remember, they're talking about take off your uniform. He took off his red checkered keffiyeh. And the grandchildren, Noah, the character that we saw here in the play, I met her. She was 18. She talked about how he kissed each of the grandchildren on the head, and that it was warm, and that there was this kind of opportunity for peace. And tragically, the person who she was more angry at was currently Prime Minister Netanyahu for inciting the violence. That she was able to shake hands with Yasser Arafat, the widow of Rabin, and refused to shake hands with Netanyahu. Last point, they kept referring to tennis. Sorry, these are all little moments in the play, how they love to play tennis. Leah Rabin said to me that Saturday morning, "I'm never going back to the tennis club," because the owner of the club criticized her for critiquing Prime Minister, well, he was the opposition leader then, Netanyahu.
Wow.
We'll get back to Netanyahu later. That's an important point. Nathan, how did you feel? How did you feel about that? What was Rabin for you when you met him behind the scenes?
Use the mic, Nathan.
Use the mic.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
thank you.
It's better.
I think, I had the pleasure of covering Rabin as a reporter. I think two short anecdotes. One of them was the first small briefing he had with a group of reporters just after being elected. And what shocked me was the fact that he was so practical and down to earth about everything. Think of it, we're talking about the 80s past prime ministers like Yitzhak Shamir, who was all about firm ideology, and Shimon Peres with the lofty ideas. And then Shimon Peres came and he just spoke about the nitty-gritty issue, Rabin, of course, about the issue itself, and he wanted to focus about the future of Israeli Arabs and his plans to help them, and was very specific about it. It was kind of refreshing. But I think the other point, and I told you about that earlier today, was this meeting. I think it was one of his earliest visits to Washington as Prime Minister, and in the evening he had a reception at the ambassador's residence, the old ambassador's residence, which Rabin of course knew because he was ambassador to Washington. And after the guests left, he just sat there with a group of few reporters and embassy workers. Maybe we had some wine. He was funny, and Rabin, as very well portrayed, he was a very shy guy, and he didn't like big crowds. But somehow in the small crowd, he started telling jokes and these funny stories about Ben Gurion and how Ben Gurion never got along with his wife, and how Pola Ben Gurion hated him back, and they both were waiting to see who would be the first one to want to leave the little hut that they lived in the desert, but they both stayed there just to spite the other. It was a hilarious and very, very surprising, because everything we knew about Rabin was that he was so shy and quiet and closed, and he opened up, and it was great.
That's nice. Laura, you're one of the only reporters who ever got to interview Yigal Amir himself. How did you manage that, and what was it like?
Yeah, I just actually leaned over to my daughter and said, I can't believe I interviewed the assassin. When I think back on it, it is really crazy. Before I tell you about that, I also wanted to say that I interviewed also the guard, the bodyguard. You know that last zone, the sterile zone? The guy who he was shot in the arm trying to protect Rabin. Yoram, exactly, Yoram. And he came to the house to pay his respects. He was on his way home from the hospital. He stopped in, and he sat in the kitchen. He just was too afraid to approach Leah Rabin. He felt so responsible and guilty. Finally, he made his way into the living room where she was sitting, and he collapsed. And he was crying and trembling and shaking, and she comforted him. It was remarkable. This was this Shiva ceremony, ritual, where you come to comfort the mourners. But she put her arms around him, and she said to him, "You're a young man. You have to find a way to move forward." And it kind of reminds me of almost like the whole nation was grieving. It also reminded me of maybe today as we try to make our way out of this horrible period after October 7th. Okay, back to now Yigal Amir. So I went to find, I was writing a profile of the assassin, and I went to his home, which is in a suburb north of Tel Aviv, and I met his mother, who was a ganenet, a preschool teacher, just a warm, wonderful, I know it's hard to imagine, but a very loving, warm mother who was raising all these little preschoolers. And his father was a scribe, a sofer in Hebrew. He would write Jewish like mezuzahs and Jewish holy texts. And I got to know them that way. And then over the years, 1 year passed, it's about 3.5 years passed, and I was invited back to their home by the mother. Yigal Amir was in solitary confinement. He was sitting in a windowless prison cell. He wasn't allowed to talk to anybody. He had one concrete desk. On it were holy books. He basically sat and studied Talmud all day and answered letters from teenage girls. He had a lot of fans. And between 6 and 7 p.m., a phone was handed through a metal opening, like a slat, like a mail slot in his door. And he had 15 minutes to speak to somebody, and then a bell would ring. So the mom invited me into their home. I went up into their bedroom of Yigal and his brother Chagai. And you could see, she sat me down on their bed, and she lifted it up and showed me where the Israeli officials had dug up and found an arms cache under their bed where they hid all their weapons. We sat on the bed, and I wrote out the questions because it could only be her voice speaking directly with the prisoner, and that's how I interviewed him on speakerphone. The first thing he said before we even asked him any questions was, "Don't ask how I'm feeling. Don't ask what I'm eating. I'll hang up right away." He was bitter, he was cynical, he was extremely depressed. So we decided to turn to politics. There was an election coming up, and it was between Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu. And she said to him, "Who will you be voting for?" And can you guess who he said?
Barak.
he said Barak. He said they're both the same. They're both continuing in Rabin's path. And he felt like Netanyahu was actually cracking down on him and all the extreme right-wingers just to prove a point. So his mother said to him, do you think it was worth it? Do you think it was worth doing what you did to spend your life in jail? And he said, absolutely. Again, this was in about 1998, early of 1999. He said, if I hadn't stopped Rabin, there would be a Palestinian state.
Oh.
So there were two really strange things that I found in common between Leah Rabin and Lahavdil, it's a really hard comparison, and Yigal Amir, is that they both hated Netanyahu with a passion, and they both insisted that the sacrifice of Rabin's life wasn't for nothing.
Unfortunately, it was a very successful political assassination. We see the results until now. And that brings me to the next question. We saw in the show, and we Israelis saw it in real life, in real time, all the incitement that led to the assassination. It wasn't Yigal Amir alone, although of course he's the only one who actually shot the prime minister, but there were rabbis issuing Din Rodef, the law of the pursuer. There were Ben-Gvir, who, as mentioned in the play, grabbed the ornament from Yitzhak Rabin's car and said, next time we'll get to Rabin himself. It was Bibi Netanyahu himself leading many rallies with Rabin dressed with SS uniforms, or with kafia being called a traitor. We know in hindsight that Israel never dealt with those responsible for the incitement. Why do you think that is, Natan?
I think that on the morning of November 5th, Israelis woke up to a certain need to make a decision. They were in a crossroad, and the nation was grieving and shocked, obviously. We were all shocked. And you have to make a decision. Are you going to try to unite, or are you going to go after the wider circle of the people who did it and who laid the ideological basis for it and who enabled it? And Israel made the wrong choice. They decided to unite. There was this fear, this maybe existential fear, that we're descending into a civil war that the nation would never overcome. And the choice was to do this thing that, remember the term self-piyutz, a call for a reconciliation, which basically meant forgiving and absolving everyone who was involved with it, except the very small circle of Yigal Amir and Chagai Amir and Margarit El-Shefi and the very few other people who were actually involved in it. And this concern that going after the rabbis who provided the rabbinical justification for doing so, center leaders who enabled this, and of course people in the political level, including Netanyahu, who were in charge of this incitement, that would break up the country. In hindsight, it was a terrible mistake because these people just eventually felt emboldened. This was November. By July of the next year, Netanyahu was elected prime minister. And 30 years later, Itamar Ben-Gvir, as we heard in the show, is the cabinet minister in charge of the police. So I think that for the sake of unity, Israel missed an opportunity of actually purging and going after the people who were in charge.
Wow.
Laura, drawing on your experience as a senior policy advisor on the U.S. State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team years after Rabin, why wasn't it possible to revive Rabin's vision in later rounds of diplomacy? What were the mistakes that were made or missed opportunities? And also, what were the takeaways from the Oslo Accord that were used in later negotiations? That's a big question.
I'll try to be brief.
Yes.
Let you all out to your dinners. Well, I think in a word, one of the reasons why Oslo was so successful, and we weren't, I was on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team under President Obama with Secretary Kerry. It's just one word: secrecy. You know, the negotiations were completely in secret. It came out as a surprise. And the public opinion on all sides, I think, can really be damaging. I think that's why the Abraham Accords also were successful. Our talks, you know, we had 5 issues that we were working on. It was Jerusalem, borders, security, refugees, and well, there were basically 4 core issues. We weren't allowed to talk about any progress that we made. So even though we actually did make a lot of progress, it was all sort of kept to ourselves, and all the sort of bad public pressure, though, was out there. And so nobody really could deliver. There wasn't, I mean, our team blamed leadership, we talked about a lot, but I think the main problem was that we weren't able to negotiate in secret, and so there was political pressure on all sides. I remember the day that the talks collapsed, my team went to Tel Aviv, and we met with the British ambassador, and he offered us a cup of tea. And he said to us, you know, we always forget that it's always the domestic politics that bring us down. And I think that was really true in that case. And I think that's why October 7th happened as well. Look, we were so close, the Biden administration, I wasn't part of that administration, but to negotiating a kind of Saudi normalization deal between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, kind of 3-way deal. And that was out there, and Hamas had an opportunity. They didn't have a seat at the table, and so they poisoned the meal. So I'd say that's the #1 problem. In terms of takeaways, first of all, from Rabin, what kind of example he set, I think what #1 takeaway is that you can't ignore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Because other people have tried outside in, inside out, different ways of leapfrogging, growing the conflict, shrinking it. However way you slice it and dice it, you have to address the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I would say the second thing that Rabin really exemplified was the idea that, look, he was a military hero, but at the end of the day, there's no military solution. It's got to be a political solution. And also that the radicals, the extremists on both sides, are the enemy, that there is a common threat really from the extreme sides all around. The other thing I think that that Rabin can teach us today is that after violent conflict, there can be political breakthroughs. He would scan the kind of strategic landscape and say, where is there an opening? That applies today after this 2-year war. Where can we see an opportunity for peace? Is it with Lebanon, Syria, the Gulf, possibly? I think that's really important. And then finally, I think one thing that Rabin exemplifies then, and we can learn from today, is the idea of breaking the conflict into small, verifiable, manageable pieces to step forward. Remember, he talked about patience, that song, Patient, Be Patient, and yet he felt impatient. We see that today, I think, with the 20-point plan. A lot of naysayers, all my colleagues were saying we couldn't get to step 1. Now we got to push through to phase 2. I think Rabin would be behind this 20-point plan. It may not come from the president you voted for, but I think that we owe ourselves and really his legacy, you know, the kind of hopeful attitude. One last thing, I'm just sitting here on the stage. I just keep thinking about Rabin. He had a chocolate drawer. That was something I discovered when I went to Amos Oz was actually on the phone, the famous Israeli writer, with Leah Rabin that morning, and I was kind of sitting there listening to their call. And Amos Oz was saying, you know, he was a closet sentimentalist. He had a little secret side. It was a chocolate drawer. It was, he had a, sorry, I'm gonna hand this over to you, so I stop talking, but he had a box of cornflakes on the sink late at night when he'd be up dreaming up his ideas. He'd be sitting there with a bowl of cereal. So it's kind of that guy, when you're up late at night, whatever you're doing, eating pizza or something, I think we owe it to him really just to keep on dreaming like he did.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
That was really nice. Yes, I am hopeful for these peace talks and the 20-point plan of Trump, of all people, but we should not forget that the Palestinian issue is the core issue that Israel needs to deal with before there's any other progress. Nathan, a similar question to you. What from Rabin's legacy is still relevant today, 30 years later, and especially after the last 2 years with so many regional changes?
I think just as Laura, as you pointed out, the most important thing is the fact that you cannot bypass the Palestinian issue, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening now, this idea that you can solve the whole Middle East without touching on the core problem, which is the occupation and the future of the Palestinian people, and it just doesn't work. There's no way around it. And Rabin understood that very well. As a military man, as a clear-eyed strategist, he knew that that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. And I think, again, the fact that he had the military credentials, he was a hero of Israeli wars, of the 1967 war. It helped him a lot in conveying the message that you're coming to this peace process from a point of strength and not of weakness. And I think that also went a long way. Doesn't mean that there weren't mistakes. I think we can learn from the mistakes of the Oslo process. The idea of this gradual and phased process in which you never state the final goal. At the end of the day, led to not only confusion but also to this false hope that the settlements would stay there, or this ambiguity about what would happen to them. And maybe it wasn't possible at the time, but the idea was to tell both people how we're going to see the end of this and work from the back forward. And one more thing is the people power. We're talking about the leaders. There was there wasn't enough of an effort on the grassroots level to make these two people basically sharing a small piece of land to know each other, to understand each other. And it was difficult then. Now it's pretty much impossible. There's a big wall separating them. There's a wall of hatred and fear. And I think that was one of the takeaways, I think, from the Oslo process. There was never enough emphasis on the grassroots level.
On this negative note, are there any questions for the audience? Yes, please.
Yes, on the issue of, in retrospect, it was a mistake not to go after the inciters and the supporters. I wonder how, in a democratic framework, I'm with you. Seems like a very good idea that you shouldn't let the people who are encouraging the violence, we shouldn't turn the other cheek and just say, oh well, shit happens or what. But I don't know. What do you have in mind? What kind of things? Would it be just an intellectual argument or a political? Because there is free speech protections everywhere.
First of all, not all countries have the same free speech as.
No, I'm aware of that, but we still don't. Yeah.
Right. First of all, on the criminal level, if you incite for violence, that is a criminal offense, and you can go after the people who did that. I would also
Not here, there.
Yeah, over there.
Yeah, okay, good.
In Israel,
Good to know.
definitely,
I didn't know.
and it was easy enough to do if you had the political will behind that. I think also on a broader level, I would expect some kind of a national reckoning on a political level, on an intellectual level.
Like a truth commission or some dialogue.
Exactly. There was an inquiry commission that made its conclusions public, that dealt more with the tactical issues, how it happened, where were the security failures. It didn't really deal with the question of incitement. I think both on the criminal level and on the political, cultural level, it could have been done.
Just to follow up to that, just because both the Israeli culture and the American culture is very much, we're living in a day of incitement, and where it's impossible for two sides to talk to each other. These aren't fringe sides, these are like, right? So I'm asking, what's the lesson forward? You know what, today in Israel, it's even more impossible, no?
Right. I don't know what the lesson forward is, but maybe it is that if you see something wrong, you have to call it out and to go after the people who did it, even if it's only on the public level. So I think the fact that Netanyahu could run for office and win 6 months after this means that there was some failure in conveying to the Israeli people what happened and the responsibility in a lot of different circles.
And he barely won, right?
Yeah, but
Barely
win
won.
is a win.
Overnight, it changed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
You said that the Rabin's widow and Amir, the assassin, you said that they had something in common. Can you restate what that thought was that they both agreed on?
Yes, both of them hated Netanyahu and were very bitter about them, and both of them felt like Rabin's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, obviously for very, very different reasons. So they shared that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
So one obvious question. Obviously things went completely off the rails after Rabin was killed. And this is, of course, nobody can answer a counterfactual, but you said Bill Clinton thought that there would be peace. Did Rabin's assassination truly, derail the peace process, the possibility of peace in the future? Would we be living in a very different world or not?
It's interesting. I think that, sorry to sound negative, even though I encourage you all to dream, I think this had to play out, and it would have played out anyway, the violence, and I don't think, but Bill Clinton, to this day, I was at Columbia, my two kids are here, they're both students at Columbia, and we saw Bill Clinton speak at a memorial for Rabin just 2 weeks ago, and he said again, what he had said to me at the time, that there would have been comprehensive peace. But interestingly, in another conversation with Clinton, I went to see him after I wrote my book, Revenge, which is a nonfiction book, a story of hope, actually, about the Middle East. He asked me to bring 3 copies of my book, inscribed. He said, I want 1 copy. He said, I want 1 copy for Nelson Mandela, who was a good friend of his and had taught him a lot about overcoming feelings of revenge, because Clinton had a lot of bitterness, frankly, toward the Republicans. And oh, oops, yeah, okay. So yes, I brought 3 copies. And then the 3rd copy that he wanted me to bring was inscribed to Yasser Arafat. It took a couple months before I actually was able to set up that meeting. By the time I got to the meeting, he said, thank you for the copy for him. Thank you for the copy for Mandela. He said, I don't want the copy for Arafat. He said, he's a lying thug, and he's violent, and he's not keeping his promises. So it's interesting, although today Clinton said there would have been peace, I think that there were problems on whatever side you're angry at today and want to blame tomorrow. So I'm not sure.
What do you think? Things be different?
I think that we'd have a better chance of having a better future, just because, first of all, Rabin's leadership, even if he did win by a small margin and he didn't have a huge majority in the Knesset, he was there and he could push it forward further. Now, the peace process didn't die after the assassination, and Clinton managed to push Netanyahu to the Hebron Accord, the Y River Accord, and eventually sit with Ehud Barak in the second Camp David. So the mechanism was there, but I think the lack of a strong leader on the Israeli side, and of course Arafat turned out to be less of a reliable partner than people had expected, and of course terrorism was an issue all the time. I think the presence of Rabin as a strong leader and a reliable leader could have helped hopefully kind of overcome these hurdles, but there's no guarantee there at all.
His approach was, we hear Netanyahu and President Trump echoing Ronald Reagan by saying peace through strength, right? That is our approach, peace through strength. I think Rabin was more like strength through peace, right? He thought that we will become a stronger nation if we have peace. And the remarkable thing was at his funeral, you could see that play out. Were you at the funeral?
No.
You were. So I was covering the funeral for the Washington Post, and it was Yaron Gaon, who's an Israeli pop singer, said to me, this is a snapshot of Rabin's dream. You had turbans and keffiyehs and robes and slippers and golden fringe. The whole Arab world, not all of them, but many of them came out to pay their respects. And rather than a nation in mourning, the whole world was in mourning. You really had a sense of strength and solidarity with Israel. It was world leaders to the left and everybody else to the right. I remember former President George Bush was seeing former Prime Minister John Major, and they were having a little reunion. An Omani minister, right? The Omanis didn't travel to Israel, was talking to an Israeli member of parliament, and the Israeli member of parliament said, "Oh, can I have your phone number?" And he gave it to him. He said, "Oh, is that your office or your home number?" So it really was this idea of, in Judaism, you have a concept of Olam Haba is heaven, the world to come, and in a way, the world had come to this moment of the funeral. So I think that was his approach, and maybe in this idea of strength through peace. Could that have powered through Hamas, though? They were out there. I mean, I was down during those same years. I was traveling to Gaza all the time, sitting down with the founders of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, and they were talking about, you know, how proud they were of suicide bombers, that the first drop of blood that fell to the ground meant that the bombers would go to heaven and the victims would go to hell. That wasn't going to go away. So give us something positive. Don't answer here.
No, we don't want to hear what I think. The baklava is tasty. Yeah, that's good.
That could be a good one.
If anyone has anything positive to send us home, otherwise,
Any of the next generation?
next generation, hopeful.
I would just
Not
like to
so
say
much.
that the acting, the singing, and dancing were wonderful.
Yes,
The
the show
production
was
was
wonderful for sure.
Well,
And it really
maybe I'll ask this. When you take art and apply music and poetry, lyrics to a history that both offers promise and it's unraveling, the image you've just left us with at that funeral, which was both a peek into a potential utopic solution and everything that unraveled after that, which is a bitter pill to really contemplate. What does an artful rendering of this process leave you with? What is the value of putting this history into an artful context?
Well, I can say that from the first chords of this show, my throat, I got verklempt, okay, I choked up, and then when you circled back to that same song at the very end, tears were streaming down my face, and I turned around for the first time and I saw many people wiping away the tears, because we all got back to that word, hope, which is after all the national anthem for Israel, and it made me feel personally like it's all our duty to try to continue Rabin's, and Leah Rabin, let's give her credit too, to surge forward with some hope, and that none of us can be excused from that, and you lifted my spirit up, and I really thank you for that with this show today. You brought it right back to that hopeful time in the 90s.
Exactly, and also the feeling that it's not over. It wasn't like there wasn't full stop there. I think that it was a smart artistic decision not to have the shot being shot there in the circle, in the Rabin Square now, the Kings of Israel Square, because it kind of left it open-ended, which is where we are now. There's still the potential of going back on track and having a better future. I think that is a positive thing that I see.
We will leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.